So welcome everyone. This meeting today is available in both English and Spanish. So I would like to welcome Sandra Ventas, who is our interpreter for today. And this slide has the instructions for how to listen to the meeting in either English or Spanish. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen on the tab, you have a button that says interpretation that Christina has circled in yellow. If you would like to hear the meeting in English, you can either stay on off, which is in the main channel, or you can put a check. You can click on the English, word English. If you would like to hear the word in Spanish, click on the Spanish button, which Christina has circled as well. And then this is our first go at using the live interpretation feature on Zoom. So Christina, thank you so much for figuring this out. Sandra, thank you so much for doing multiple trial runs with us. And we are keeping our fingers crossed it will work well. And so in the vein of transparent technology and communications, Sandra, let me know in the Zoom chat box if there's any issues. And the meeting's being recorded in English and in Spanish. The slides will be available in English and in Spanish. And so you'll be able to share the information we talk about today with colleagues and friends who are not able to join us this morning. Okay, so next slide, please. So again, welcome. I hope you all had a lovely 4th of July weekend. By way of introductions today, if you could go ahead and put your name, your organization in the chat box, and one thing you're going to do today to bring you joy. And again, it's on our collective efforts as a collaborative to prevent vicarious trauma. For those of you that are new to the community collaborative today,
You're muted.
I know. I don't know what happened.
Sorry, that was accidentally. Sorry.
I had a hard time getting in this morning. I had to put the meeting ID in 3 times before it would let me in.
Okay.
Never done that before.
Okay. Well, thank you for the heads up. And we'll pay attention if other folks are having an issue. So thanks for joining us this morning, Edie. So yes, our collaborative works together to address the fundamental needs of our residents in the Tahoe Truckee area. This is our monthly resource sharing meeting where our partners come together to talk about issues impacting the Tahoe Truckee community. We have an opportunity to share resources, talk about what's going on in the region. And I'm thrilled today that at 10:30, Ingrid Cockhren will be joining us to talk about ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences, and race. And so thank you to the partnership with Tahoe Forest Health Systems, ACEs Aware Network, and our folks who are working with us on our race and equity work. It was definitely a collective effort bringing this training today. So I'm thrilled to welcome Ingrid right at 10:30. So until 10:30, we are going to spend a few minutes hearing about a new TART pilot project. We're going to hear from Sarah Monson, and I think I saw Christine join as well. And
yes, Christina's here.
Great. And then after that, we'll spend about up to 12 minutes or so doing some quick resource sharing where everyone will have an opportunity to talk about programs, updates that they want to share with our broader collaborative. And then we will again welcome Ingrid at 10:30. So just 2 pieces of housekeeping, which I will remind us of throughout the meeting. One, Christina will post an evaluation form at the end of the meeting. Please take a few minutes to fill that out. We look at those closely. And then secondly, because it is the beginning of the new fiscal year, so happy new fiscal year, we do have to track meeting demographics. So Christina is putting a meeting demographic form in the chat box. We ask all of our partners to fill it out once a year. So if you could take a moment to fill out the demographic form, if you do it today, you won't have to do it again for another year. That would be very helpful for our meeting tracking. So at this point, Sarah and Christine, I will turn it over to you probably for the next like 6 or 7 minutes or so. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Christine's going to get us started today. Oh, not what I wanted to do. Here we go.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. I'm Christine Maley-Gerbel, from the Executive Director of the Truckee North Tahoe TMA. And Allison, thank you for including this on your agenda. Sarah and I are going to tag team on this, and also just to be mindful of our time limit. So I'm going to jump right in here. I know you have a lot of other really good presentations this morning too. So you might, most of you probably are all familiar with the Truckee North Tahoe TMA. For those of you who aren't, we're a public-private partnership. We are a nonprofit collaborating on transportation solutions along the North Shore and in Truckee. And one of our programs that we manage is actually marketing and outreach for TART service regionally and in Truckee, and then also any other programs to really promote getting people, when possible, out of their cars and onto transit. So today, as Sarah's showing you here, we're really excited to talk a little bit about TART Connect. That's the logo for TART Connect. It's very similar to the regular TART logo. We wanted to have something that people could really see that they are related programs. Next slide, Sarah. So the TART Connect is a microtransit pilot. It's an on-demand shuttle service that started, many of you may have seen this, along the North Shore on June 24th. And this runs actually through Labor Day. It's running daily, 8 a.m. to midnight. It's managed by the Placer County Department of Public Works. And also through the TMA, we're helping to assist with this too by managing the Incline Village Crystal Bay portion of this program. There are 11 vehicles in service total, and there are 3 zones. I'll talk a little bit more about the zones in just a minute. This is an app-based on-demand program. It has a goal of reaching people who request the service within a 15-minute time frame, and it is curb to curb, so it will pick you up within the zone and take you throughout that particular zone wherever you would like to go. And as I was mentioning, it's branded as a service of TART. Next slide. It's a 75-day pilot, as mentioned, and the funding is coming from Placer County, and that is being funded through transient occupancy tax dollars that were made available based on the newly passed North Lake Tahoe T-bid that you may have heard about. And then in addition, Incline Village Crystal Bay Visitors Bureau is also funding the service through some TOT dollars that they have available for their particular zone. What we're excited about is at the end of this pilot program, we'll be able to evaluate the data of ridership, where people would like to ride, what are the most requested places they would like to go, what time is best for them, a lot of good data for us. And we will have a final program report about this program in October, November timeframe. Next slide. So you'll see from the zones, the first zone actually runs from a Dollar Point area all the way down to Sugar Pine Point, so outside of the immediate West Shore, so that it can also service that area. Next slide. And then our zone 2 actually is running from, as you will see, Kings Beach and Tahoe Vista and the Brockway area. And then the next slide. Zone 3 is the Incline Village Crystal Bay area to Stateline. Now I'm going to let Sarah jump in and tell you about the marketing and outreach for the program.
Yeah, so another really important thing about this program is it is free. So spread the word on that. And we are marketing both in basin and out of basin to try to get both locals and visitors aware of this program. You can download this program on any phone that you have looking up the TART Connect. That's the name of the app. If for some reason somebody does not have access to apps, you can go on the Tahoe Truckee Transit website, and we have a phone number that people can use as well to call. So it's accessible to anyone with a phone, even if they don't have the app. So here's just a look at some of our concepts. And the really important thing I want to share with you all about our marketing is that you can help us by spreading the word. And if you go on to TahoeTruckeeTransit.com/summer 2021, there's a link to our media kit. You can find the TART Connect. We have a Facebook page. You can share our posts. Our press release is on there. We have a post you can share. We have pictures. We have the logo. So feel free to share this with anyone who you think might be interested or on any of your social media platforms. And this is just one of many summer programs that TART is offering and other service providers are offering. So we also have TART, the summer schedule has begun. You can find that on the website. And we're offering service this summer till 1 a.m. in most places, not on the West Shore because it is being serviced till midnight by TART Connect. We're also, of course, offering the TART Connect program. There's a regional park and ride program on weekends. And then RTC is offering a flex ride service, which is offering service from Truckee Meadows to Incline Village and Sand Harbor, or between the two. So you can go in either direction. And that's also an app, so you can look that up. The message we really want to share with everybody is that you can have car-free summer fun in 2021. There's all these options and you can kind of link them together so that you don't need to use your car, and together we can help reduce traffic in the area. I also want to make sure people are aware of the North Lake Tahoe Express, which offers airport shuttle service between the Reno International Airport and Truckee and North Tahoe. And then those park and ride lots, just so you're aware of where they are, there's one at the TTUSD parking lot, and it provides service to Tahoe City Transit Center. And then there's also one at North Star Castle Peak, and it offers service to the North Lake Tahoe Event Center. And this is on the weekends. You can find more information again on our website at TahoeTruckeeTransit.com/summer 2021. I'll put that in the chat when we're done. And here's our contact information. So feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions. And if I see anything in the chat, I'll get back to you in there as well. And all right, I think that's our time. Thank you so much.
You're very efficient, Sarah and Christine, so thank you. And again, like Sarah said, you can put any questions in the chat box. And I just wanted to say a thank you to you both and the Transportation Management Association in general. You have been one of our partners for many years. And as you all know on the phone, transportation is one of our most significant challenges for our local folks who are seeking to access resources, medical services, get to work. And so we really appreciate you being fierce advocates for a sustainable and a workable transportation system for our local people. So thank you very much for all the work that you do. We are really, really grateful.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, so we are thrilled and really looking forward to the next hour of our resource sharing meeting. This is a partnership with the Tahoe Forest Health Systems ACEs Aware Network, and we will be talking today about ACEs, race, and historical trauma. And we wanted to say a special welcome to Ingrid Cockhren. Ingrid graduated from Tennessee State University with a BS in psychology and Vanderbilt University's Peabody College with a Master's of Education in Child Studies. Her research areas are adverse childhood experiences, collective trauma, historical trauma, and intergenerational transmission, brain development, developmental psychology, and epigenetics. Ingrid is currently an adjunct professor at Tennessee State University, specializing in developmental psychology, abnormal psychology, and personality theory. And she is also the director of communications for PACES Connection, which is a social network dedicated to raising awareness of positive and adverse childhood experiences, stress, and trauma. So at this point, Ingrid, I'd love to turn it over to you. And again, welcome to our Community Collaborative of Tahoe Truckee. And thanks for being with us this morning.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I hope everyone can hear me. I've been told that I speak pretty softly. I'm going to share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. So I will say that as we move forward, when we get to the end of this presentation, hopefully, fingers crossed, there'll be some room for some questions at the end. And so at that point, I'll stop the screen, but I definitely will invite everyone to turn their cameras on because it's better for me to not feel like I'm talking to the void. But that'll be towards the end. So if we can get through this, that'll that'll give us some time at the end. In the meantime, if you do have a question, I think that you may have access to the chat feature. You can also, don't feel in any way bothered by interrupting me. So you can also come off mute and ask questions as well. This site here is this is something for you to do on your own time. I think today, because of the time constraints, we won't be able to do this in real time, but this is an implicit association test that is provided by Harvard, and they have been compiling data on implicit bias and association since about 1985. And this is an assessment that will allow you to assess your own biases. And so there's several tests there. So I suggest that if you're interested in assessing your own bias, to check out the site. The one that is most prevalent bias in our country, in America, is skin color. So this is a good way to kind of assess your own bias and see where you are. But they have others besides skin color, like gender, weight, sexual orientation. So I think this is a great site to check out for your assessing your own individual bias. But today we're going to be talking about ACEs, race, and historical trauma. And really putting it all together when it comes to the big picture of race and how racism is a traumatic experience in our country. This presentation, I've been presenting on historical trauma since, wow, about 2016 now. And when I first started presenting, really no one was that interested, but it seems that this has become a lot more interesting to the public, especially as we see issues around critical race theory in the news, and also last year's kind of civil unrest around our racial reckoning here in America. And so people are more interested in historical trauma. And so that'll be the focus of our session today. And really, it's going to be about giving you some key terms and then being able to conceptualize how trauma manifests itself in our society when it comes to race specifically, because race is connected to identity. And so when we are dealing with trauma that's associated with identity, like race or gender or sexual orientation, it is a pretty pervasive and life-changing trauma that is difficult to address. And so we'll talk about why it's difficult to address and how it's connected to identity and how it manifests. And then at the end, we'll talk about what does it mean to address it in a real way. So first, the basics. What is race? Here in America and in most Western societies, when we talk about race, we're really talking about a category that has been pretty much shaped in our society from the 1600s and 1700s century. And so what does that mean? When we think about race, as far as we conceptualize it, it comes mostly from the 16th century, where European elites decided that there were classifications of race, and they put it within the genetic framework when it's actually a social construct. And so from then on, and since then, we really have conceptualized race as a genetic issue. And we have attributed social constructs or more social or cultural differences between us to race. And that is in part due to certain key figures in our past. First, we have Darwin, who really brought genetics and evolution to the forefront of science in the 17th century. And he had several underlings, most famously Francis Farrar, who then began to really construct what race looked like within Darwin's evolutionary context. And so we have something of rumblings in the 16th century around race that became more concrete in textbooks and in schools in the 17th century. And those textbooks really outlined several different things, but one of the main takeaways is that there were 3 categories of races. First, we had superior race, which was at the time called Caucasian, or what we would consider white today. And then we had semi-civilized or semi-savage races, which were at the time Asian races, especially the Chinese. And then we had what we would call savage races, which were the indigenous races, or what we would consider the natives in the Americas, and Africans. And each one of these classifications received social characteristics in those textbooks. With the white race, social characteristics were advancements in science and civilization. With semi-savage or semi-civilized races, a lot of it was centered around the ability to communicate the structure of their societies, and also their ability to trade and some sciences. And the savage races were considered to be devoid of culture and civilization. As we know today, indigenous people and Africans had very complex civilizations and cultures. And so this was an issue of ignorance about those cultures specifically, but mainly because, in the 16th century, we were not really traveling a lot. So there was very little known about African and indigenous cultures. And the reason why Asians would be considered semi-civilized is because they were doing a lot of trade with Europeans. And so the first trade in Europe was mostly with Asians around spices and silks and things of this nature. And so that interaction allowed for those European elites to conceptualize Asian cultures as semi-civilized. And this is something that we know today is just not correct, but at the time it was considered cutting edge science. And this is something that we also need to think about with ourselves as we look at ACEs science and epigenetics. All science, when it comes to the social political context, is skewed by what we know at the time, right? To include our racist ideologies, our biases, and any type of limitations that we have. And so this was the case back then. The social political context of the time when they conceptualized race was largely happening at the same time as colonization and the genocide on the African continent, as well as genocide of indigenous peoples. And this was really somewhat of a way to justify the treatment of certain groups. And so the takeaway here is that race is not genetic. We have learned through the field of genetics that there is no genetic race, and that there's actually more genetic diversity among races than outside of them. And so then that leads us to critical race theory. So if there is no genetic race, then what accounts for the differences among us is cultural and environmental. And then of course, culture and environment go hand in hand. So if we think about African slaves in America, for example, when we think about culture, we think music, food, dress, religion, and traditions. And so you have a group of people who have been separated from their traditions and language forcefully. So when they arrived here, they were not allowed to speak their own language. They were not allowed to practice their own customs or religion. Their religion was considered pagan or demonic, and so they weren't allowed to practice that. And then of course, the ability to be able to understand each other and the importance of slaves not being able to communicate with each other as far as having revolts or running away, prevented them from being able to speak their own language, which means they had to come up with a culture that was based on their conditions at the time, the environment. And so they created what we now know as soul food today. So most of the Southern cuisine is slave cuisine. They created their own music, but we also will see that they had to adapt their parenting practices to slavery and other things that we think of as cultural today. And so this really shows that if we believe what the science says, that race is not genetic, then that means that the differences amongst us is based on environment. And so how do we create environments that sustain some and traumatize others? And this is, at least in America's case, has been mostly policy driven. So we create policies, institutions, and systems, and then we either exclude or include people into those systems and policies, or we create policy directed towards certain people to be exclusionary or to ensure the prosperous environments for others. And so this is what critical race theory is saying. Critical race theory is a law theory. I'm not really sure why it has become such a hot button issue in education. No teachers are being taught critical race theory. It's definitely not being taught in any school because it's a law theory. It was developed by a Harvard law professor in the 70s, Dr. Derek Bell, to account for racist structures within the legal system and racist policies. And so these are the 4 tenets of critical race theory. And so we'll use this to be a bit interactive. So as I read off these 4 tenets, you let me know if you agree, disagree. This is definitely a no judgment zone. So the first one is that white supremacy is deeply embedded within our society and it's permanent. I personally agree with this tenet, but I know that many people don't because they would like to believe that it's not permanent, or they don't think that systems can be inherently racist or support one group or not. So yes, no, or maybe in the chat if you agree with this first tenet. The second one is pretty similar, but it's focused on institutions, not our society as a whole, but our institutions like education, our legal system, our healthcare system. And it's saying that racism is institutional, not individual. For this one, I don't agree. I think racism happens on both the institutional and individual level. But Dr. Bell believed that racism in America was institutionalized. And what he's really saying here is that, let's say you create a system that, and at the time, the people who create that system are racist or biased. And then they create a system and then they die off. And then people next generations that come along, they inherit this system and they work within it, within the laws that have been written and the procedures that have been set and the norms that have been set, but they themselves are not racist. He would say that just because the system is set up to be racist and biased, that even if the individual is not racist, they're working within a racist system so that the outcomes will still be the same. So take some time to think and put it in the chat. Do we believe that racism is institutional in America? The third tenet is talks about intentionality. Even if we know that when we look at social determinants of health or other statistics, we find that people of color are most likely to have poor outcomes or poor educational outcomes or lower IQ scores or have an issue with economic stability, we might not always agree that it was intentionally built for that reason. So the next question is, America's power structure is built to marginalize people of color. So is it just happening by chance, or was that the intention for our systems in America, our power structure? And so the last tenet is really talking about when we looked at the definition of race, that race is a social construct, but in America, that race has been used as a tool to stratify power. So has our society intentionally used race to stratify power? A good example would be if we believe that there's only a certain amount of pie that we can get. Are we using race to say that certain people get bigger pieces of the pie and some people get less of the pie? And so is race being used as a tool to stratify power? And so these are the basic tenets of critical race theory. And this is kind of the foundation we want to have before we move into the rest of our session, because oftentimes, because America is so race focused, we can forget that race is not an indicator of anything. However, racism is. So the environments that people experience because of their skin color is really the issue that's driving the differences between us, as opposed to the skin color itself. And this is important because even when we talk about race, we talk about it within the fault being put on the people of color. And we'll talk a little bit about racial socialization, but it's a good example of how Black and brown children are getting the brunt of responsibility of racism. They're taught how to behave and how not to behave and what to do when they're out in public spaces so they can navigate racism, as opposed to their parents teaching them that, you know, some groups are racist and this is not exactly your problem, but just you need to be aware of it. And so how we even talk about race puts the burden on people of color to adjust to the system. And so it's good to have an exercise that grounds us in the understanding that race is not a real thing. It is a construct. And so we're all familiar with ACEs. But I always like to include it that it follows a certain pattern. Adversity in your childhood disrupts neurodevelopment, leads to impairment, the adoption of health risk behaviors, disease, disability, and social problems, and ultimately early death. The 10 categories outlined initially were very straightforward: abuse, neglect, and these 5 particular household dysfunctions. Further studies, especially the Philadelphia study, have outlined other experiences that can be just as detrimental as those first 10. And you'll see here that the majority of these experiences, including the first 10, are more impactful for people of color. So even in the first 10, people of color are more likely to experience those situations in their childhood. Specifically, when I say people of color, I'm speaking specifically of African-American, mixed or interracial children, Latino communities. And you will see here intergenerational and cultural trauma, which is what we're going to talk about today. So when we're talking about trauma within the context of this presentation, or historical trauma, it is mostly racial trauma. And racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress is something that we have recently started to conceptualize in the mental health industry in America. But obviously it has the same outcomes associated with any type of trauma. PTSD-like symptoms are often the result. Issues that we associate with PTSD, like insomnia, aggravation, hypervigilance, obviously flashbacks and things of that nature. And then also the physical issues like headaches, chest pain. And so this is a trauma classification, just like any other trauma classification with its typical consequences. However, when it comes to racial trauma, it can be experienced in lots of different ways. Obviously, we have direct. So this would be experiencing an interaction with an individual that maybe someone on the street yells a racial slur at you, or your teacher says something that's obviously racist, especially in the form of microaggressions in school or in your neighborhood. These are direct. And just like any other type of trauma, we can experience vicarious or secondary stressors. So this would be a perfect example would be last year with the video of George Floyd's murder. This traumatized those who watched it, of course, of any race. However, you will find that those who watched it that were both Black and male were the most impacted by that. And that's just social learning theory because of issues of identity, which again, race is tied to identity, are going to be more impacted. And so beyond just videos of police brutality, we have also what children of color experience in their neighborhoods. So as they see other people of color, other people who look like them experiencing trauma on a consistent basis, they will also be vicariously traumatized. This most commonly happens with Indigenous and African American children, and then also Latino communities at a lesser degree. And then we have transmitted stressors. And so this is when we get into the cultural aspect of trauma. When we talk about historical trauma or intergenerational trauma, these are what we call transmitted stressors. So chattel slavery is a collective trauma that then was passed along through generations. So the parenting practices that were skewed because of historical trauma, the changes in diet that happened because of slavery, the internalized racism that happened because of slavery. These are then passed along through generations through cultural and traditional practices. You will also see this very widespread among Indigenous peoples. Very clear historical trauma from family separation due to boarding schools, obviously the genocide and forced relocation and removal from land. These are all historically traumatizing. And I will say that Native American and Latino communities are very closely related in our country. They often share the same bloodline as American Indigenous peoples, mainly through this forced relocation. So many Indigenous Americans fled south and north, fled mostly south. And so Central and Southern American people who descend from them often have shared ancestry with Indigenous Americans as well. And so when we look at epigenetic changes, those are going to be the same, but again, to a lesser degree. And so let's talk a little bit about racial identity. Racial identity is pretty much the process of internalizing your race. We often can talk about this easily through gender. So gender like race is another social construct. that is so pervasive that we believe that the differences are substantial when they're not, the differences between men and women. But it's mostly social. So if we can conceptualize how women and men perform their gender, right? The different things that we believe that we have to do to project femininity or masculinity, we can also conceptualize how we perform our race. And so this happens through a process of racial socialization. This is an interesting way to really see how we are living in different realities as a nation. You have children of color, especially Latino, Indigenous, and African-American children, being raised with their parents going through a process of indoctrinating them into American society. They're telling them very explicitly, this is what you're going to experience in America because your skin is brown or Black. This is how you have to act in America because your skin is brown or Black. One of the easiest ways to understand this is how parents talk to their children about police. Some parents will tell their children, if you're ever in trouble, call the police. The police officer is your friend. They're a public servant. They're here to serve you. They're here to help you. And then other parents are telling their children to be wary of the police. The police will kill you. You need to make sure that you are on heightened awareness when you are around the police because they are suspectful of you because of your skin color. And this is a perfect example of how we have institutions in America. I use the legal, law enforcement as my example, but you could do the same with medical, you can do the same with education. Some parents are saying your teacher is there to help you. Some parents are saying you can't trust your teacher. They think you're stupid. They're not going to give you the best advice. Some people are saying, you should go to the doctor. Every time you have anything wrong with you, go to the doctor. The doctor's going to help you. And others are saying you can't trust doctors. They don't have your best interest at heart. They are just experimenting on you to see if things will work. This is what people are passing along, messages they're passing along to future generations based on the historically traumatic past that we have in America. Another way to think about racial socialization is Erickson's industry versus inferiority stage. This is the stage which we often think about as middle schoolers. This is when, before they get to teenage years, when they are able to see how differently the world treats them based on their gender, socioeconomic status, skin color, how the teacher in the classroom responds to Bobby versus other children, how the teacher in the classroom responds to little girls versus little boys, how the teacher in the classroom responds to kids of different skin color. They are picking up on these messages and they will internalize them as issues of industry or inferiority. And so very quickly, by the age of 5, children are able to recognize and identify racial hierarchy in our society. One of the best experiments that we have around this is the doll study that was done in the 40s to determine if segregation had a negative impact on Black children. And they would take a white doll and a Black doll and ask children to say which doll was nice, which doll was smart. And Black children would overwhelmingly say that the white dolls were nice or smart. And since then, since that initial study, they've done other studies on all children of all different backgrounds. And that is held up. The majority of children will have positive attributes for the white doll. And all children included in the study are between ages 3 to 5. And so this says that even though children do not know about the social construct of race, that they are picking up messages from their environment that point to a racial hierarchy, and that white is considered to be more positive, more attractive, smarter, and nicer than Black or brown. And then we have Bronfenbrenner's social ecological model. Bronfenbrenner really just outlined that child development is not centered just on parenting, but it is due to several forces or spheres of influence, to include neighborhoods, schools, policies, geography, and then of course our larger beliefs and values as a nation, and then of course generational issues like children developing in the social media age versus children who developed during the world wars. And so these really help us to understand that racial socialization is a process by which we begin to understand and create an identity for themselves and how we perform our race. I will say this, African-American families are the most likely to racially socialize their children and have explicit rules for them and how they should act based on their skin color. After that, Latino families and Indigenous, after that, Asian. And then of course, we have white families who are taking a more implicit or passive role in racially socializing their children. They either don't talk to their children about race at all, or they have, they lean on the colorblind messaging, which is that we're all the same. And this is essentially gaslighting children. It's actually gaslighting on both sides. Parents of color who are telling their children they have to be different and special, or have to work harder, or have to adjust to avoid racism. First, that's not true. They're not going to be able to avoid racism. You know, they can't dress their way out or have good behavior out of racism. And then on the other end, white children who are being told that we're all the same can just look around them in their environment and understand that they're not being treated the same in the society. And then it becomes an issue that's difficult to understand for children because they're getting mixed messages from their parents and the adults around them.
So Ingrid, I apologize for interrupting. I just want to draw your attention to a question in the chat box.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Kat. And so Kat asks, is Asian including Middle Eastern, or is Middle Eastern still considered Caucasian?
To be honest, Middle Eastern is kind of split between Asian and African. And so there's not a lot of research on Middle Eastern families, but they are doing more than white families to racially socialize their children, but not as much as Latino and Indigenous and African American. So they're very close with Asian families as to the amount of racial socialization they're doing. And I say this because when it comes to Asian and Middle Eastern families, they often will not talk about race except for when there's incidents of racism. And so for example, right now, Asian families are having to talk with their children about race because there's an increase of violence against Asian communities because of COVID. But it might not be something that they're just talking about specifically on a regular basis. Also, and that's the same thing with the Middle Eastern families. So after 9/11, there was an increase of racial socialization within Middle Eastern families to prepare them to experience bias because of religious or actual issues of skin color, but they have not had to do so historically. And another thing to talk about is how Asian, Middle Eastern families and also Latino families are still subject to white supremacy, just like any other group. And so they are also taught through the society or through parenting to be what we would call anti-Black. So there is also racism, it's a very complex issue. So they might not being taught to be racist or explicitly taught that white people are superior, but they may be still receiving anti-Black messaging from parents, which is pretty consistent across most racial groups, including Black families themselves. So that kind of talk about that internalized racism. But that's a great question. And so it is different between each group. And I will say that our research on race is Black and white, just like we are just as polarized in our research. So most of our research is focused on white families and also African-American families. And next body of work would be Latino families. We have a large body of work there, but we are definitely in a deficit when it comes to Asian and Middle Eastern families. And so I've included these two models. You should receive this. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but it just helps to conceptualize how people of color, how their racial identity develops. And so you'll see here in childhood, dominant white culture prevails. They receive the messages from the larger community, which is that white is right, Black is wrong. And like I said, this is people of color, so all people are getting this messaging. All people of color. It started out with just Black people that they were doing this study on, but they've done more studies since then, and we're able to validate this study for all other non-white groups. And then you see encounter, which is when they have their first racialized experience. The darker their skin color is, the earlier this will happen. So children are experiencing encounters early as 5 and 6 years of age. Someone telling them that they're different because of their skin color, because of the way that they look. And then when we look at white identity, we see that for the most part, it starts with color blindness. May be able to acknowledge the differences between races, but not until we get to disintegration do we have racialized experiences that cause guilt and shame. This is older for white children, so mostly in adolescence and in college years does this happen. And this is when they have their first experience with racism that causes guilt and shame. So white children have experiences and witness racism often, but it doesn't mean that they internalize the experience and register as an issue of guilt and shame. So I want to clarify that. It's not that before high school and early college years, white people aren't noticing or witnessing racism. However, it doesn't move you into the next stage unless it's accompanied by some sort of feeling of guilt or shame, which then makes you think about your own racial identity and the differences between yourself and other people. Reintegration is kind of the blame the victim stage. In my experience, most people that I go through this process with are at the blame the victim stage. America as a whole is still at the blame the victim stage. What that looks like is, you know, Black and Latino families would be better off if they were better parents. Or Black and Latino families would be better off if they just moved out of the neighborhoods that they live in. Or they would be better off if they just got better jobs, or if they went to college, right? And it changes depending on the time. There was a big to-do about Black people needing to go to college to better themselves in the 70s. And so there was a huge push for education as the key, and that it was because Black people were not educated as to why they were experiencing racism. And now you have Black women as a group that has the most higher education attainment and yet still make less money than white people with just a college degree or even a high school diploma. And so this is, again, an example of blaming the victim, not acknowledging the systems of racism and bias, but instead saying that people of color should just do X, Y, and Z better. Pseudo-independence is that I believe that racism does exist, but now I need you to teach me about it. I need you to tell me what's racism, what's not. This one is an interesting stage because it is a reflection of how deeply embedded white supremacy is in our society, that people believe that this is the way that it should be, and cannot conceptualize something outside of that. And so right now, a good example of that is the pushback on critical race theory, where you have a very clear, pushback on any type of ideology that goes against American exceptionalism. And these things are seen as a personal affront. So if I say I want to teach about the history of America as it pertains to Black and Latino and Indigenous people, people are very upset about it. And this is a reflection of how much people are expecting people of color to address their own issues, even though the systemic issues that are there are embedded within systems, and systems are always more powerful than individuals. Immersion, acceptance of white identity, being anti-racist, and then, which is a buzzword right now, anti-racism. But according to Dr. Janet Helms, the height of white racial identity is actually autonomy, which is the pursuit of social justice. And also, again, just not being dependent on people of color to be able to say what's racist, what's not, or what to do about racism. And so definitely reflect on this question. Where are you in your stage of development as a person of color or as a white person, however you identify? You don't have to share, but it's just a reflection. Thinking about the first time that you were made to feel other because you're a person of color, or the first time that you felt any type of shame or guilt or shame about a racialized experience that you witnessed or were a part of.
So Ingrid, I apologize, just to clarify, do you want Christina to put us into short breakouts?
No, I just
No,
included
okay.
this because we were talking about breakouts, but
Okay.
yeah. But for the sake of time, it's just a short reflection. So again, I picked those first or those second phases because they're kind of critical to your racial identity. The first time you realize as a person of color that you were different. And then the first time that you realize as a white person that racial issues were a source of guilt or shame for you. And so let's get back to talking about this within the framework of trauma. The RISE Center does a great job of reflecting on how Anda's pyramid can be adjusted to address historical trauma or racism. And so first thing, in Anda's pyramid, the first one, the smaller one, it's very straightforward. This is what we know what we've seen several times around the ACEs study. The larger extended pyramid from the RISE Center adds in historical trauma, which is really saying even before you were born, the trauma of your ancestors is impacting you and makes it more likely for you to experience trauma in your lifetime. So the trauma of my great-great-grandmother is going to make it more likely for me to experience trauma in my lifetime. And then it also adds social conditions and local context. So for me, in Nashville, Tennessee, we have the zip code that has the highest rate of incarceration in the country, 37208, and or what we would call North Nashville. And in North Nashville, there's a 10-year difference in life expectancy than just 10 minutes away in our nice fancy Green Hills area. So being born in North Nashville makes it more likely for me to experience trauma in my lifetime, even though I'm living in the same city as someone who is born in Green Hills. And so when we get to the adversity stage, the same as Dr. Anda's, we have ACEs, but you'll find that people of color, especially African-American, Indigenous, and Latino children, experience complex trauma, which is going to be 4 or more. ACEs. When we get to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, the RISE Center incorporates that allostatic load. Allostatic load is the wear and tear on your DNA from adverse conditions that are happening all the time. A good example of how to conceptualize allostatic load right now is to think about how you've been over the past year, 2020. In 2020, you were probably a little bit more irritable, maybe had a hard time sleeping, maybe ate less or ate more, had low energy, probably were a little bit more clumsy than usual. All of this is allostatic load because 2020 and the pandemic and all the things that happened in that year is a collective trauma. And so you had low level stress all the time, this having a wear and tear effect on your DNA and causing brain fog and things of that nature. And then when we have the adoption of health-based behavior, the RISE Center conceptualizes this as coping, that people of color and other groups are dealing with historical trauma. And I would also like to include historical or intergenerational poverty in this as well, that they are just coping with the stress of the systemic nature of their issues, coping with the stress of racism, coping with the stress of poverty, ongoing poverty. And then, of course, we have disease, disability, and social problems, which the RISE Center conceptualizes that when we look at people of color, people dealing with historical trauma, that their disease, disability, and social problems are not seen as sources of empathy or sympathy, but they are often criminalized or stigmatized. So mental illness in, I could use an example of African-American Latino youth living in dangerous neighborhoods. They are obviously displaying symptoms of PTSD. However, their mental illness is conceptualized within our society as criminal behavior and not as a group that's suffering from mass PTSD, but that they have a culture of criminality. And then lastly, we have early death. And so obviously this is very apparent in African-American and Indigenous and Latino children and families because of life expectancy, differences in life expectancy, with African-American men who are the group that's experienced the most discrimination, having a life expectancy of 10 years less than the general population, life expectancy of just 70 years. Also most likely to experience early death, accidental death, and violent death. Let's see. This is the same for, African Americans and Indigenous as obviously, but then also descendants of the Holocaust also have a shortened life expectancy as well. And so this all stems from collective trauma. These widespread, collectively traumatic experiences of people of color or people who are being ostracized because of religion, or people who have experienced an economic issue that then leads to generational poverty of any race. These are considered collective traumas. And what happens in a collective trauma is that it shatters a group's sense of safety. And that then changes the way that they interpret their environment, the way that they change, the way that they raise their children. I mean, you have to think, one of the things that we really talk about a lot in our field is African-American parenting. It's what actually got me into the field that I'm in now. At Benefit, I was focused on African-American parenting practices, which gets a bad rap, and the most Hispanic more likely to be aggressive with their children, things of this nature. But then you have to think about, what would the parenting practices of a slave mother be? How strict would she be on her child if her child's disobedience or breaking of the rules were life or death? But not only life or death for the child, but life or death for the community. And so if your child you know, even beyond slavery, if your child, even in Jim Crow, if your child was caught breaking the rules for Black children in a white neighborhood, it could be that they could come back and, you know, burn down your whole town. What type of parenting practices would you need to employ for that type of environment? It would be extremely aggressive. It would be extremely strict. And so we had to think about all the different ways that that collective traumas, you know, ripple through our lives down through generations. It's not just the trauma then makes it more likely for you to have PTSD. It changes the way you parent. It changes the way you eat. It changes your sexual and romantic relationships. It changes how you interact with each other. You could internalize racism. And it definitely forces you to go through a process of meaning making. If you're on the right side of meaning making, then you can basically navigate that process while holding on to dignity and holding on to good mental health. But not only that, but putting the fault where it lies, so not putting the burden of racism on your children. But if you can't do that, if you're unable to, then you will say, well, this is my place in the world, or my race is a burden. And then you will fall into issues of despair, mental health issues, and poverty. And so the meaning-making process is important. Another word for this is intergenerational transmission. Intergenerational transmission is not just for children of color or Black children or Latino children. All of us go through intergenerational transmission. And the reason why we still have racism in our country is because of intergenerational transmission within white families. So this is not certain groups are more susceptible to intergenerational transmission of trauma than others. All groups are doing this or participating in this. And so I'm going to speed through some things, but 4 main avenues of intergenerational transmission are maladaptive coping, drugs, alcohol, isolation, and then survival-based parenting practices, which we talked about already. Definitely social learning, so children wanting to be like the adults in their space, especially the adults that are the same gender as they are. And then genetics, so we have clear evidence at this point that traumatic situations and abuse and stress change our genetic material and its expression, causing issues like cognitive impact, mental health, poor mental health, and then the onset of chronic diseases, like we very clearly saw in the ACEs study. Intergenerational transmission is also known as historical trauma. It becomes historical trauma when it's isolated to a certain group. So that group is usually religious or racial in nature in our society. More so racial because, again, America is extremely race focused. And I want to give credit to Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart as coining that term in the 80s. She was an indigenous, or she is an indigenous social worker. And so I want to look at what can be done. And of course, you will have this presentation. And this is just some historically traumatic events that I can outline throughout history. You will notice that pandemics are on the list. So you will see fallout from 2020 over the next 10 to 15 years for sure, especially in those who went through the pandemic the youngest, so children who experienced 2020. But when we look at solutions, we already know what the problems are. Groups who experience historical trauma are more likely to be delineated by race, also poverty, war veterans, children and adolescents are especially vulnerable. The LGBTQI community is vulnerable, even though they are not connected by genetics. The historically traumatic events around sexuality and sexual orientation impacts them as a group and leads to poor health outcomes and other issues as well. And our symptoms are also very straightforward. We know what they look like in our society. Again, these are things that we often attribute to race as opposed to environment. But with the understanding that there is no genetic race, then we know that the environments that people are being subjected to are what are driving these symptoms. One of the most controversial ones is going to be lower IQ, because again, this is something that we consider or has been definitely attributed to race in the past. But as we know more about genetics, we understand that environment impacts IQ. IQ is not, it is not concrete, it's not static, it's more fluid based on the environment. And then the most impactful one is going to be relationship difficulties. The inability to form relationships is going to be the most impactful because relationships act as buffers against trauma. And so when we look at what works, we have to look at Bronfenbrenner's social ecological model for direction as we look at, you know, the layers of trauma that can happen in each one of these areas, in homes and neighborhoods, in our larger society, within policy. That's also where the healing can occur. And so you will have, first on the individual level, you have the ability to have positive childhood experiences. And the research is very clear on this, that positive childhood experiences can be a buffer against adversity. And just as we all marveled at the ACEs study and how impactful it has proven to be, and how we can really see that adversity is impacting children, the positive childhood experiences study is just as impactful because it tells you very clearly that if you craft positive interactions and experiences for children, it will act as a buffer against their adversity. And then lastly, we have the liberation and healing through social ecological model here, also from the RISE Center. So the individual, community in place, systems and institutions in history and legacy and structure. And it shows how to heal in each one of these spaces. And you have a copy of this as well for your own needs. So we're right at time. So I didn't do a good job of carving out space for Q&A, but I can stay a little longer and participate in that if that's needed, especially around this last one where it shows like what it looks like to do it in real time. Your group is going to be at the community in place and has some influence on the systems and institutions. But if we look at community in place, that's going to be where you're going to get the most bang for your buck as an organization. So radical inquiry, first, that's kind of what I'm doing today, showing how systems impact people, educating people about, you know, especially those that you want to reach. If I'm a child living in a community, in a poor Latino community, if you don't engage in radical inquiry, you leave that child to believe that it's because their skin color is the real issue, or that there's something deficit about their culture, as opposed to showing them that racism exists and that there are real efforts to make sure they live in certain areas or don't get the best of the best, that it's not just because of skin color. Popular education is letting people, first is teaching real history. So that's a big issue there. You know, not being so focused on American exceptionalism, but showing that, you know, areas where American has fallen short and then what that looks like and how it can be restored. Culture building, so celebrating and affirming one's culture, one's own history within the larger framework, creating healing spaces, creating space for arts and expression. And probably the most important is base and power building. So my understanding is you have communities of color who are, you know, they don't have power? What does it look to give them that in a real way? And obviously that would be political and otherwise. So that's going to be base empowerment, and that's going to be rallying communities together to address the problems that they have, and so that they can build political power through numbers. And that's going to be very important for the systems level change that you want. So I'm going to stop sharing and see if we have any questions or discussion.
Thank you, Ingrid. And I just, want to say before we open up for any questions or discussion, I really appreciate you ending on that slide. And I feel like a lot of the work the folks on this call do really fall within like that building beloved community and those other pieces. So thank you for ending on that.
No problem.
So you can either put your questions in the chat box or raise your hand.
And it could be about anything. So it can be about processes, it could be race specific, but I also work in collective impact. I'm a psychology professor. I'm also work with intervention. So it doesn't have to be exactly tied to what we've talked about today. Really, it's just a time for you to use me as a resource across the board.
So Ingrid, what would you say about the healing spaces part on that last slide? You said in the community in place. Can you give an example of that maybe, or some strategies?
Yeah, that's probably good on the micro level, so neighborhood level. This is going to be about finding who those neighborhood champions are and helping them to kind of ink out spaces in the areas that they live in that are off limits to any type of violence or gang activity, or this is going to be kind of like the micro level neighborhood decisions that people are making to create safe spaces for children. It could be, usually it's schools, but it could be somewhere in the neighborhood that's not a school. It could be a playground. Usually people like to do murals in their neighborhoods a lot. So it could be a space where you could paint murals, but then also that could be the space where it's safe for children to be at any time. Schools do a really good job of this as well, because they have such ability to control their environment, and that they can create healing spaces within schools, places for children to go. It's child-centered, but again, this is also for adults. So that's going to be on the neighborhood level to kind of facilitate the process for neighborhoods to create their own healing spaces, places that are off limits for anything that would be considered violent or negatively impacting people. So no drug zones, no gun zones. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ingrid, I've got a question. I'm Shannon Decker and I work in suicide prevention. And for the past 6 months, I've been responding to a tribe over in Nevada who's had some contagion with suicide. And I was on a phone call yesterday with some people back in DC, and they had said something that was hard for me to swallow. They said, it's taken years, it's taken generations to get to this point. It's going to take generations to heal. And I think that's just a really hard pill for me to swallow. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you've seen where there's been tangible improvements when it comes to this cultural trauma piece, to the generational trauma, to just help with hope.
Yeah, so especially with tribal and also with descendants of slaves, a big part of issues around suicidality and depression is the separation from traditional practices. And so what that looks like, or what could be a hack for that, is to really have very intentional like healing rituals. Either start new ones if they don't have them, or use the ones that they have but aren't used, but haven't used or haven't done traditionally. So it's really going to be a little bit of research, but if they're tribal, they kind of already know what they are, but probably are not engaging in them. And so that's going to be the source of their depression, is because they're not engaging in traditional practices on a regular basis. Those traditional practices that's what they're meant to do. That is the point of them, is for healing and the continuation of traditions and tying people to their ancestors, which often is kind of the first to go when depression and things of that nature set in. And you can think about that for yourself. Things that you do to make yourself feel good on a regular basis when you're depressed, those are kind of the things that you let go. So if you normally exercise to make yourself feel better, when you're not feeling good, that's when you notice that you don't feel like exercising. So so those kind of healing practices are usually tied to indigenous practices. For natives, it's going to be a little easier because they're there. They're documented. It's just going to take a little digging and then getting people in the habit of doing them for specific reasons. So I would start with having an event where that is the specific thing that they're doing for that specific purpose. And then, because I'm not an expert on Native culture, but I'm sure that they already have traditions for that. And so following on those is going to be the best way to go. For African Americans, it's going to be a little harder. It's going to be more about creating rituals for people because they have absolutely no idea which tribe they're from or things of that nature, and don't have the money to find out. So it can be something general, something like that's West African, because we know most of the descendants of slaves come from West Africa. But definitely the ability to create new ones is also a thing as well. So healing practices that can become, on a schedule that we're going to do every month. Every month we're going to get together and we're going to do this, or every week if it's intensive and needed. I hope I'm answering your question.
Yes, absolutely. And with this group, they don't have those healing practices. They don't know. And so there have been others who have brought things, like they did a 5-night fire and kept the fire going. And I said, is this part of your practice? Is this part of your lineage? And they said, no, but this is what the kids wanted to do. So we'll do it. So it's helpful. Thank you. I think getting those started, and for this specific tribe, they've been shut down for COVID up until this past weekend as the first community event. So hopefully that'll start to change.
Yeah, so I would just do that, but do it more often, and say that we're engaging in it more often because we're recovering, right? And again, if it's tribal and you know the tribes, then you can research and find out what their specific rituals were. And then of course, like if it's for kids, you can just start new ones because, but that is a very clear distinction for the most part when it comes to Indigenous and Latino communities. Their trauma is manifesting in internalized behaviors like suicide and depression. And African American communities, theirs is internalized, externalized behaviors like acting out in school, not being able to sit still, ADHD-like symptoms. So it just varies.
Thank you, Ingrid. And before we wrap up, Sandra, I just, since you're interpreting for us, I direct message you if there's any questions in your group. If you just want to put a question, or if there's anything, you put it in the chat box. Just want to give you a second to do that.
I got a question in the chat as well from Ellen, so I want to make sure I'm getting that question correct. So if you can come off mute and tell me what you're talking about, Ellen, I can be able to answer.
My question was regarding like the intergenerational trauma, regarding being able to move past that in regards to like the recent findings of like the Native bodies within Canada at the colonization schools.
Yeah. I won't say to be able to move past that. For the most part, Natives, I won't say they've been able to move past, but they've been knowing what's been happening in those schools. They're very aware of why children didn't come back or were missing. They're aware of the stories from the children who were able to come back and tell those stories. That's an issue for Canada to make amends with. You know, again, kind of the narrative is that we're putting so much on people of color to get over or to, I guess, resolve their own trauma. But much of this is going to be about restitution and reparations. So what is Canada gonna do is the better question. I think Native Americans, besides needing a very clear apology, they've already gone through the process. They know that those children were murdered or abused. They know why they didn't come back. And so, you know, white Canadians need to know. And then in Canada as an institution needs to provide restitution to those families.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name too. I thought it was an N instead of
It's okay.
or I.
Well, thank you, Ingrid. And I know that we are over time, so I really appreciate you staying on the call with us. I really appreciate such a thorough overview. It's a ton of information. It was really helpful. I know we talked about on the phone, and our partners know this, that we've been kind of bringing information and resources about race and equity to our collaborative partners. So this is our first official training. So thank you again so much for all the information and for folks on the call. The slides will be available to you in English and Spanish, as will the recording. And I would just say in closing as well, in addition to thanking Ingrid and thanking Sandra so much for providing the interpretation, and thank you to Christina for figuring this all out. I really encourage all of us to do something today to kind of help metabolize all the information that we've learned today. I know it was a ton of information, and a lot of it was like I definitely had like a physical reaction to a lot of the information. And so one of the things we've talked about with this group is like really metabolizing information that we hear and emotions that come up as a result of participating in trainings in this one in particular. So I really encourage you all to go for a walk or, you know, get some fresh air or do something. So Ingrid, I don't know if you have anything else in closing before we wrap up. But I'm really, really grateful for you being with us today.
Oh, no, just thank you for having me. And again, that Rise Center slide with the spheres of influence, it's going to be really helpful for you to kind of, you know, I tell people to use that for strategic planning, to kind of think through what interventions would look like. And so, yeah, I hope that was helpful for you.
Great. Thank you, Ingrid. Well, we really appreciate it. It was great seeing you all today, and enjoy your 6th of July.